What's up guys, welcome back. This is Anime Crossover. You'll be watching What If Naruto Was Mugetsu Part 14, let's begin. Noitra Gilga's shrill, metallic laughter scraped violently across the ruined white masonry, robbing the dead air of the last of its oxygen. Ichigo Kurosaki stood between the Quinta Espada and the crying child with green hair. His battered fingers curled around the heavy manji guard of Tensa Zangetsu, but his physical vessel was empty. His muscle fibers had been drained of the usual pale blue reishi humming. Each breath was fierce, a flavor of burned quartz and oxidized copper. "Look at her," Noitra roared, spitting a big glob of dark blood onto the white sands. He kept the second scythe, the one he'd found in the rubble, dragging along the ground beside him. His burned flesh smoked in the artificial sunlight. "She's back to being a pathetic, leaking piece of shit. Your time is up, Shinigami. The absolute reality of the board is unchanged." Ichigo said nothing. He lowered his center of gravity, ignoring the screaming agony in his newly healed ribs. His combat boots were rooted in the stone by the biological need to protect the child. Noitra's single predatory eye slitted. The wild ecstasy was beginning to turn to a cold rotting disgust. He looked at Ichigo's trembling arms, and the heavy black iron that was hanging dangerously parallel to the floor. "You're tired. You're exhausted," Noitra said, the hard vibration of his voice flattening. "You don't have the kinetic energy to swing that black toothpick. I'm not going to waste my sweat cutting up a dead body." The Quinta Espada leaned his rusted scythe on his shoulder and looked toward the rim of the crater. "Tesla," Noitra commanded, the oppressive atmosphere pressing down on the courtyard. "Finish the Shinigami off. Break his bones, one by one. Make him taste the despair of the desert." The blonde sub emerged from the thick shadows of the smashed wall. Tesla did not contest the order. He walked past the weeping Nell, his boots crunching on the pulverized quartz, his stoic, apathetic face unchanged. He stopped 10 yards in front of Ichigo, pulled out his Zanpakuto and held the steel blade flat against his chest. "As you wish, Noitra-sama," Tesla droned. He concentrated his reishi, and the ambient density of the air warped violently around his physical vessel. "Crush, Veruga." The subordinate released a cataclysmic blinding burst of heavy brown reishi. The kinetic shockwave swept the last of the dust out of the courtyard, causing Ichigo to brace himself with his heavy boots just to stay upright. When the reishi cleared, Tesla's physical mass had shifted catastrophically. He was turned into a giant, bipedal warthog. He was a gigantic, heavily armored, minotaur-like beast. Thick, bone-white reishi plating covered his chest and arms, and a massive set of curved tusks jutted from his mask. The physical atmospheric pressure radiating from the released Arankar was crude and incredibly heavy. Tesla did not pause. He didn't bother with the physical space, he ran with a devastating, earth-shaking momentum. Ichigo forced his tired muscles to respond violently, bringing the sleek black steel of Tensa Zangetsu up in a desperate horizontal block. Crunch. The physical force of Tesla's attack had simply gone through the heavy iron. No blade was involved. The beast just drove his massive, reishi-infused shoulder straight into Ichigo's chest. The blunt force of the kinetic was Armageddon. Ichigo's guard was shattered violently. His physical vessel rocketed backward into the air, crashing catastrophically into the base of a ruined pillar. The heavy impact jolted the last of the oxygen from his lungs and Tensa Zangetsu slipped from his bruised fingers, clattering uselessly against the stone. "Ichigo!" Orihime screamed, her voice tearing raw in the dead air. She desperately threw her physical weight forward, her pale hands rising to deploy the golden reishi of her Soden Kishan. The biological urge to violently reverse the slaughter flooded her veins. Noitra vanished in a flash of Sonido, and reappeared in front of her. He stretched out his lank, badly burned arm and his long fingers gripped the fabric of her white uniform violently, halting her momentum. "You don't do shit, woman," Noitra hissed, forcing her to her knees. "You're going to see the trash get pulverized." Tesla walked slowly toward Ichigo's prone body, beside the shattered pillar. Ichigo tasted clean ashes. He tried to push himself up with his bruised hands against the crushed masonry, trying to force his physical vessel up. The black water boiled fiercely in the deluged architecture of his soul. The pale, sleeping avatar of Naruto Uzumaki still slept upon the cracked stone, but the ancient, implacable gravity of the god burned with a fierce, blinding refusal to yield. Tesla slammed down a massive, heavily armored boot right on Ichigo's right leg before he could lock his knees. The silence was shattered by the heavy, sickening crunch of breaking bone. Ichigo clenched his teeth, not wanting to give the Arrancar the satisfaction of a scream. His lip bled warm, the kinetic trauma of the blow coursing through his nervous system. "You don't have the mass to survive this grid," Tesla said cleanly, raising his massive boot to crush Ichigo's ribs. "Disappear." The giant boot came down, aiming to crush the Shinigami's chest. Suddenly, the real atmospheric pressure of the courtyard went catastrophically into free fall. It wasn't a clinical zero, or a surgical reishi targeted. An impossibly dense, chaotic, unrefined golden yellow gravity devoured the dead air violently. It had the taste of rusted blood, of violent steel, of absolute, unadulterated slaughter. A jagged, chipped blade of dull iron the size of a mountain exploded straight through Tesla's massive chest. The heavy steel sliced the subordinate's kinetic momentum in 1 microsecond. Tesla froze. His huge eyes widened in utter, absolute shock, hot blood spewing from his mouth. Out of the settling dust behind the paralyzed beast, there loomed a gigantic, terrifying shadow. He wore a torn and ragged white captain's haori over a tattered shiakusho. The black hair was spiked with tiny bells that chimed softly in the awful silence of dead air. A heavy black patch covered his right eye. Captain Kenpachi Zaraki easily ripped the jagged iron from Tesla's back, and the massive, dying Arrancar fell heavily onto the white masonry. Kenpachi lazily leaned his broken Zanpakuto against his shoulder, his single, bloodthirsty eyes staring at Ichigo's exhausted face. The sky was the 11th Division's, with an absolute and undeniable gravity. "You're taking too long, Ichigo," Kenpachi drawled, a feral, massive grin stretching across his scarred face. "If you're done playing in the dirt, get out of the way. I'm taking the rest of the board." The physical air in the shattered courtyard was severely warped. The suffocating, rotting reishi of the Quinta Espada was devoured instantly by a terrifyingly dense golden yellow gravity. It tasted strongly of old rust, fresh copper, and the pure joy of slaughter. Captain Kenpachi Zaraki stood over Tesla, who was paralyzed and dying. He didn't give the beast a second glance. The small bells woven into his spiky black hair chimed softly, creating a stark contrast to the astronomical atmospheric pressure emanating from his physical vessel. Ichigo Kurosaki struggled to breathe in sterile oxygen, his bruised fingers slipping from the white masonry. The dark water settled deeply within his soul's flooded architecture. The pale, sleeping avatar of Naruto Uzumaki remained asleep on the cracked stone pillar, but the heavy, ancient gravity emanating from the inner god recognized the arrival of the vanguard's strongest blade. The pack responded to the biological need for survival. Neutra Gilga released his grip on Orihime's uniform. The lanky Espada slowly turned his neck, his predatory eye locked on the Shinigami captain. The absolute, visceral malice emanating from Neutra flared, clashing violently with Kenpachi's suffocating atmospheric pressure. "Who in the hell are you?" Neutra hissed, clutching the heavy steel chain of his rusted, double-crescent scythe. Kenpachi Zaraki, the captain drawled, a feral, massive grin spreading across his scarred face. He casually placed the jagged, chipped iron of his Zanpakuto on his shoulder. "Captain of the 11th Division. You appear to have a hard shell. I have a desperate biological need to see if my iron will pierce it." Neutra's predatory eye widened in uncontrollable fury. "I'm the Quinta Espada," Neutra roared. He violently launched his physical vessel across the pulverized quartz, avoiding physical space. He swung the colossal double-crescent blade down in a devastating, hyper-condensed vertical arc, intending to sever the captain in half. Kenpachi did not retreat. He maintained his center of gravity. He simply swung his chipped blade up in a lazy, one-handed block. Clang. The kinetic collision was catastrophic. The sheer blunt shockwave pulverized the remaining white masonry, creating a massive hurricane of heavy dust in the fake blue sky. The sound of heavy steel grinding against rusted iron drowned out the surrounding wind. Kenpachi remained unfazed by the Espada's massive size. His feral grin remained unchanged. "Is this it?" Kenpachi laughed, pushing the heavy scythe back with raw kinetic force. "Do not disappoint me, monster. Swing harder." The kinetic shockwave of the clashing blades still rippled violently across the ruined white masonry, stripping the dead air of its remaining oxygen. Captain Kenpachi Zaraki did not change his center of gravity. He stood tall, one calloused hand gripping the chipped and unrefined iron of his Zanpakuto. The Quinta Espada's huge rusted double crescent scythe pressed hard against the Shinigami's guard, sending a blinding spray of orange sparks into the blue false sky. Neutra Gilga's single predatory eye twitched. The crushing, suffocating atmosphere of pressure coming off the captain did not bow to the sheer physical mass of the Espada. "You think you can stop me with one hand?" Neutra howled, his grating, metallic voice ringing high, vibrating against the shattered pillars. Neutra jerked the heavy steel chain, stepping fully into Kenpachi's guard. He drove in a savage hyper-condensed thrust of the crescent tip straight for the captain's heart. Kenpachi merely twisted his chest half an inch to the left. The rusted reishi of the scythe slid by his vital organs, slicing through the pristine white fabric of his haori with a clean slash and leaving a shallow, bleeding gash across the muscular ribs. The captain didn't blink. A deep guttural laugh vibrated in his throat, drowning the chime of the bells woven in his hair. "You missed the center, insect," drawled Kenpachi. He did not take back his chipped iron. His physical form surged forward violently, ignoring the blade in his own side as he swept his Zanpakuto in a brutal, horizontal arc toward Neutra's exposed neck. Screech. The sound in the flesh was tortuous. Kenpachi's heavy, crude steel blade crashed into the neck of the Quinta Espada. Sparks flew in a cataclysmic shower illuminating the courtyard, but the iron did not cut through the flesh. Neutra's hierro was absolute, thick enough to block the kinetic trauma completely. Neutra laughed, feral and arrogant, and kicked his long leg out in front of him, knocking Kenpachi to the ground. "I told you, Shinigami," sneered Neutra, leaning the heavy chain on his forearm. "My hierro is the hardest in all of Las Noches. You are a broken, raw toothpick that can't pierce my skin." Kenpachi dragged his heavy boots across quartz sand to stop his momentum. He didn't look angry. He reached up with his free hand and wiped a smear of hot blood from his own ribcage. He looked at the crimson stain on his fingers and his massive, scarred grin expanded impossibly. "Hardest skin, huh?" Kenpachi whispered as the heavy reishi of golden yellow violently condensed around his towering form. "Good. This wouldn't satisfy my need to cut you if you broke on the first swing." Ichigo Kurosaki clenched with his bruised fingers the manji guard of Tensa Zangetsu at the edge of the trampled courtyard. His tongue bit the copper taste, but the pain in his broken leg and fractured ribs was beginning to fade. Orihime Inoue knelt beside him, her pale hands glowing with the warm, golden light of Soden Kishun. She said nothing. She was concentrating on the present, on the physical process of sewing his broken bones back into place. The biological need to keep him whole ate up her fear of the two monsters ripping the space apart in front of them. In the dark flooded architecture of Ichigo's soul, the black water was heavy and watchful in its stillness. The pale, sleeping avatar of Naruto Uzumaki atop the cracked stone pillar did not stir. The inner god slept, content that the vanguard's pack had the physical mass needed to hold the perimeter. But Ichigo's physical vessel shook violently. The opposing desires in his chest scraped violently against one another, the absolute, logical necessity of staying down and letting the golden reishi heal his biology, versus the fundamental, burning refusal to sit in the dirt while his allies bled on the board. "Don't go anywhere," Ichigo, Orihime said softly, feeling the kinetic tension coiling in his shoulders. "Your leg is broken, man. You haven't the weight to stand." Before Ichigo could force a reply out of his throat, the physical atmospheric pressure of the courtyard exploded. Kenpachi threw his body forward with a violent lurch. The golden yellow reishi cracked the white stone under his boots. He hadn't used shunpo, he'd used plain, unrefined kinetic velocity. He brought the chipped iron down hard on Neutra's shoulder. Screech. Once more the sparks flew, the heavy blade halted by the invulnerable hide. But Kenpachi didn't stop. His golden yellow intent was violently deluged by the feral, unhinged ecstasy of the slaughter. He placed both hands on the hilt of his Zanpakuto and lowered his center of gravity to put as much kinetic weight behind the blade as possible. "Cut!" Kenpachi bellowed. The 11th Division's reishi was heavy and unrefined and acted as a violent wedge crushing the atmospheric pressure between the steel and the skin. With a sickening, heavy sound of tearing meat, the impenetrable hierro of the 5th sword gave way violently. The chipped iron bit deep into Neutra's shoulder, shredding the muscle fibers and tearing through the dense reishi armor. A huge violent spurt of hot dark blood shot into the false blue sky, soaking the white masonry. Neutra's one eye bulged in profound, utter shock. His own blood, undeniable, broke his arrogance. He staggered backward, clutching the horrible wound with his puny fingers. Kenpachi ripped the heavy blade free, letting the hot blood dribble from the chipped steel onto the quartz sand. "There," Kenpachi drawled, his eye burning with utter deadliness. "You bleed like everything else." The shattered courtyard's physical air tasted of oxidized copper and the suffocating, heavy static of the captain's golden-yellow reishi. Neutra Gilga staggered backward, his pristine white boots carving erratic, violently deep trenches in the pulverized quartz sand. He clutched his severed shoulder, hot blood running freely through his long, lanky fingers. The raw reality of his own bleeding flesh overcame his arrogant logic. His predatory eye focused on the tall, scarred Shinigami standing in the center of the crater. "You cut me," Neutra hissed, his voice high-pitched and metallic, shaking in disbelief. "My hierro, you pierced it." Captain Kenpachi Zaraki rested the heavy, chipped iron of his Zanpakuto against his shoulder. The small bells woven into his spiky black hair chimed softly, providing a stark contrast to the terrifying kinetic intent emanating from his physical vessel. "I told you," Kenpachi said, a huge, feral grin spreading across his scarred face. "I just swung harder. Your skin is dense, but not completely. It just means I don't have to hold back my iron to avoid severing you in half." Neutra's disbelief was shattered, fueled by a visceral rage. The heavy, rusted reishi violently erupted from his core, transforming the artificial sunlight into a sickly yellow haze. "I'm the Quinta Espada," Neutra screamed, extending his uninjured arm wide. He didn't pull back. He violently propelled his physical vessel forward, abandoning any pretense of tactical defense. He swung the massive double-crescent scythe down in an erratic, blinding flurry of heavy blows. The heavy steel chain whipped violently through the still air, attempting to atomize the captain's skull. Kenpachi did not dodge. He stepped into a devastating hurricane of rusted steel. Clang, clang, screech. The kinetic collisions were deafening. Kenpachi violently swung his one-handed grip, deflecting the heavy, double-sided strikes with brutal, unrefined accuracy. He didn't care about the grazing cuts on his arms and chest. The feral ecstasy of the slaughter overpowered the biological pain. Kenpachi shattered Neutra's defenses with a loud roar. The heavy blade bit violently into the Espada's uninjured arm, severing the dense reishi armor and slicing to the bone. Neutra screamed as the scythe slipped from his grip. He stumbled backward, his physical vessel drenched in his own warm blood. Ichigo Kurosaki stood at the edge of the ruined courtyard, witnessing the horrific slaughter. He lay flat on the white masonry, the warm, golden reishi of Orihime Inoe's Soden Kishun constantly flooding his crushed leg and shattered ribs. The biological necessity to heal pinned him to the stone, but his bruised fingers remained locked around Tensa Zangetsu's manji guard. The black water within his soul remained still, despite the darkness and flooding. On the cracked stone pillar, Naruto Uzumaki's pale, sleeping avatar remained motionless. The inner god's ancient, unyielding gravity acknowledged the 11th Division's fangs as supreme. The board didn't need the vanguard's pale blue intent right now. The pack had secured the perimeter. "He's tearing him apart," Ichigo rasped, his brown eyes fixed on the feral captain. "Keep your breathing steady, Ichigo," Orihime said softly, ignoring the devastating shockwaves that shook the courtyard. Her pale hands did not shake. The deep, unacknowledged comfort of his physical safety anchored Reishi. Neutra Gilga dropped to one knee in the crater. The Quinta Espada stared at the pulverized quartz, his breathing heavy and rattling in his bleeding chest. The realization that he was being slaughtered by a Shinigami who had not yet released his Zanpakuto shattered his arrogance. Neutra raised his trembling, blood-soaked hand. He did not reach for his heavy scythe. He reached for the large, jagged eye patch that covered the left side of his face. He violently ripped away the fabric. Under the eye patch, there was no eye. There was only one dark, lightless hollow hole in his skull, surrounded by cracked, bone-white mask fragments. "You think you've won, Shinigami?" Neutra hissed, his voice dropping from erratic to a heavy, demonic echo that chilled the dead air. Kenpachi stopped walking and rested his chipped iron at his side. His one eye narrowed in pure, unadulterated anticipation. Neutra raised his arm and picked up his weapon's heavy steel chain. The rusted reishi collapsed around his long, lanky body. The atmospheric density increased dramatically, with a strong taste of dead insect shells, rotting copper, and unyielding despair. "I am the absolute apex of the executioners," Neutra said, the rusted iron of his scythe violently glowing with a blinding yellow light. "Pray, Santa Teresa." The dead air shattered. A blinding hurricane of yellow reishi erupted from the Quinta Espada, violently ascending into a fake blue sky. The kinetic shockwave pushed Kenpachi back, forcing the captain to lock his heavy boots into the stone. The suffocating smoke abruptly cleared. Neutra Gilga's physical form had changed. His lanky frame had elongated even more, with bone-white reishi plating covering his chest and legs like a heavy insectoid carapace. But the most terrifying shift was in his arms. He no longer had two. Four massive, multi-jointed arms extended from his torso, each wielding a colossal, new scythe-like blade of pure, hyper-condensed bone and steel. The Quinta Espada raised all four heavy blades with a feral, unhinged smile on his face. "Let's see how you block this, Shinigami." The physical air in the courtyard tasted strongly of rotting copper and the suffocating, heavy static of the Quinta Espada's transformed reishi. Neutra Gilga was towering in the center of the pulverized white masonry, with artificial sunlight reflecting off the dense, bone-white carapace covering his elongated torso. Four massive, multi-jointed arms reached out from his sides, each wielding a colossal, crescent-shaped blade of hyper-condensed bone and steel. The atmospheric pressure emitted by the released Santa Teresa distorted the dead air, turning the sky above him a sick, jaundiced yellow. "What's wrong, Shinigami?" Neutra sneered, his heavy demonic voice scraping against the stone. "You look paralyzed." Captain Kenpachi Zaraki did not retreat. He stood motionless, his single eye widening as he absorbed the sheer, unadulterated physical mass of the four heavy blades. The small bells in his spiky hair chimed softly in the unexpected, reishi-charged wind. Kenpachi's scarred grin gradually widened, revealing his teeth. "Paralyzed." Kenpachi let out a deep, booming laugh, physically shaking the dust off the crushed pillars. "I am just admiring the bored, insect. You actually grew two new arms. That means I have more of you to hack to pieces." Kenpachi did not wait for Espada to strike. He violently propelled his physical vessel forward, his heavy boots shattering the stone below him. He lowered his chipped, unrefined iron in a devastating two-handed vertical arc. Neutra did not attempt to dodge. He raised his arms and caught the captain's zanpakuto between his bone sides. Clang! The kinetic collision created a deafening shockwave that ripped through the courtyard. However, the Quinta Espada stood firm. The four-armed stance provided absolute and terrifying leverage. "You are a predictable beast," Neutra roared. While Kenpachi's blade was locked against the top two sides, Neutra thrust his lower arms forward. The heavy bone blades cut through the Shinigami's guard, slicing violently into Kenpachi's abdomen and chest. Hot blood was violently sprayed across the white sand. At the edge of the crater, Ichigo Kurosaki violently ground his teeth together, the sharp taste of copper flooding his mouth as he watched the captain suffer the devastating kinetic trauma. He tried to use his bruised fingers to lift Tensa Zangetsu's Manji guard, his biological need to help his comrade fighting against his depleted reserves. "Stay still, Ichigo," Orihime Inoue ordered, her voice dropping in volume and radiating only a heavy, unwavering concentration. Despite the blood on his black coat, she maintained her composure. Her pale hands were locked inches above his crushed chest and shattered leg, with the warm, golden light of Soden Kishun pouring relentlessly into his biology. The fractured bone in his femur was violently knitting back together, and the deep laceration across his ribs was closing. She lingered a second too long, her thumb gently pressing against the uninjured fabric of his shoulder, focusing on the tactile reality of his survival rather than the monsters tearing the sky apart ahead of them. The dark, flooded architecture of Ichigo's soul gently rippled with heavy black water. On the cracked stone pillar, Naruto Uzumaki's pale avatar remained asleep. The ancient gravity emanating from the inner god anchored Ichigo to the stone. He did not need to swing the sword right now. The 11th Division's fangs were sufficient. Kenpachi Zaraki remained upright in the courtyard's center. Despite the deep, bleeding gashes across his chest, the captain did not take any steps backward. He looked down at the hot blood on his torn white haori before looking directly into Neutra's single eye. Kenpachi started laughing again. Good, Kenpachi growled, the golden yellow reishi erupting around his muscular frame, ignoring his physical pain. If you couldn't even scratch me with 4 blades, this would be tedious. Kenpachi violently twisted his wrists, forcing the heavy, chipped iron through the locked guard. He ripped his zanpakuto and stepped straight into the storm of swinging bones. Neutra erupted in uncontrollable rage, launching a barrage of strikes. The 4 colossal scythes merged into a single, heavy wall of kinetic destruction. Kenpachi parried, dodged, and violently traded blows, sustaining grazing cuts on his shoulders and thighs before landing his own devastating, unrefined slashes against the Espada's carapace. The courtyard was filled with the sound of grinding steel and the intense heat of mutual slaughter. The physical air of the pulverized courtyard was gripped by the screech of heavy, grinding steel and the intoxicating, suffocating heat of mutual slaughter. Captain Kenpachi Zaraki did not lean back. The golden yellow reishi violently erupting from his physical vessel warped the artificial sunlight to match the heavy, rusted atmospheric pressure of the Quinta Espada strike for strike. He swung his chipped, crude iron in devastating, erratic arcs, rejecting standard Shinigami forms for pure, feral kinetic destruction. Neutra Gilga shrieked, his 4 humongous, multi-jointed arms spinning in a blinding storm of bone and steel. He used his upper left scythe to block the descending blade of Kenpachi and tried to drive the lower right blade straight into the captain's stomach. Kenpachi did not evade. He extended his bare, calloused hand, clutching the razor-sharp edge of the bone scythe in his palm. His fingers sprayed hot blood violently, but the captain's grip was iron absolute. Gotcha, growled Kenpachi. He roughly jerked Neutra's trapped arm forward, ruining the Espada's center of gravity, and thrust his chipped zanpakuto through the joint of Neutra's upper right shoulder. The heavy, unrefined steel bit through the dense reishi carapace and sliced cleanly through bone. Neutra's arm, which still held the massive scythe, dropped heavily on the white masonry. Kenpachi laughed a long, hard laugh, ignoring the terrible gashes in his own chest. You've got a lot of arms, bug, but you're still sloppy. Neutra retreated a step, the eye of his prey opening wide with absolute shock. But the shock had violently evaporated, replaced by a rotting, feral grin. You arrogant beast, Neutra hissed, Shinigami. The rusty, heavy reishi flared angrily about his severed shoulder. In one brilliant microsecond flesh and dense carapace exploded in a catastrophic burst, and a brand new arm, fully formed, complete with a fresh bone scythe, regenerated instantly. As long as my head is attached, my biological vessel will repair itself, Neutra roared, raising the air pressure violently, and I'm not done. The carapace on Neutra's belly exploded violently. 2 more huge multi-jointed arms burst from his torso, each holding another gigantic crescent blade. 6 arms. 6 heavy, hyper-condensed scythes of pure kinetic destruction. The released intent of the Quinta Espada physically ground the remaining white pillars into dust. Neutra didn't give the captain a moment to get used to the board moving. He was gone, his sonito covering the physical distance in the blink of an eye. Kenpachi was violently engulfed in a cataclysmic, blinding flurry of 6 heavy blades. In desperation the captain raised his chipped iron, but the sheer, overwhelming mass of the 6-armed assault skipped his guard. Kenpachi's arms, chest and neck were deeply, violently, devastatingly gashed. Kenpachi's physical vessel was thrown back, crashing hard against the white stone, a large pool of hot blood soaking his torn haori. At the edge of the crater, Ichigo Kurosaki ground his teeth together savagely. Orihime's Soden Kishun had stitched his broken femur back together, the golden reishi slowly simmering back into the pale blue muscle fibers. The absolute, undeniable need to rise and protect the bleeding captain did violence to his exhaustion. The dark, flooded architecture of his inner world rippled violently in the black water. Pale, sleeping, the avatar of Naruto Uzumaki did not stir from the cracked stone. The ancient, unyielding gravity of the god burned with fierce, absolute refusal to witness a comrade fall. Ichigo forced his bruised fingers closed around the manji guard of Tensa Zangetsu, pushing his physical vessel upright, his breath rattling in his healed chest. Ichigo, get out of this. The heavy, absolute order echoed through the courtyard, arresting the dead air. Captain Kenpachi Zaraki slowly dragged himself out of the massive pool of blood, his own. He didn't look broken, he looked profoundly annoyed. He dropped his chipped iron on the stone. 6 arms, eh? Kenpachi drawled, bringing his calloused hand up to his face. Well, I suppose I can't really have fun with this fight if I keep giving myself disadvantages. Kenpachi's fingers tightened on the heavy, jagged black patch covering his right eye. With one violent motion he pulled the eye patch from his face. The air in Las Noches shattered catastrophically. The heavy, jagged black eye patch hit the pulverized white masonry with a soft thud. Las Noches' physical reality collapsed inward, rather than simply warping. The breaking of the absolute seal on Captain Kenpachi Zaraki's spiritual pressure caused a kinetic event horizon. The golden yellow reishi violently erupted from his physical vessel, rising into the phony blue sky not as a hurricane, but as an astronomical, hyper-condensed pillar of pure stellar mass. The courtyard's atmosphere felt oppressive due to gravity. The reishi did more than just press against the skin. It acted like a supermassive black hole, devouring the surrounding oxygen and violently warping the light emanating from the artificial sun. Neutra Gilga's 6-armed stance was violently staggered. The Quinta Espada's single eye widened in profound terror as his heavy, rusted reishi was swallowed by the blinding golden yellow gravity. What is this physical mass? Neutra roared, but his voice was drowned out by the captain's unsealed intent. Kenpachi rolled his shoulders and ignored the deep gashes on his chest. The small bells woven into his hair rang wildly in the reishi-charged gale. He reached down with a single, calloused hand and retrieved his chipped, unrefined iron from the cracked stone. I forgot how light the air feels without that thing, Kenpachi said, a massive, unhinged smile spreading violently across his scarred face. Now, then. Let us finish this. At the edge of the crater, Ichigo Kurosaki ground his boots into the stone, forcing his body to stay upright against the crushing atmospheric pressure. The golden light of Orihime Inoue's Soden Kishun flickered under the astronomical weight. Her pale hands remained locked, refusing to yield the perimeter of his healed biology. The dark water within Ichigo's soul shuddered violently. The massive kinetic displacement caused ripples throughout the void. The pale, sleeping avatar of Naruto Uzumaki remained asleep on the cracked stone pillar, but the inner god pulsed with ancient, unyielding gravity. It was a silent, unequivocal recognition that the Shinigami captain had the structural density of a true apex predator. I'm the Quinta Espada, Neutra shrieked, his rotting pride violently rejecting the board's absolute reality. Neutra charged forward with 6 massive arms wielding bone sides, aiming to atomize the captain. Kenpachi did not dodge. He didn't even lose his center of gravity. He swung his chipped iron up in a slow, one-handed arc. Clang. The physical collision was catastrophic. Previously, Kenpachi's one-handed attacks had struggled against Neutra's iron. The Espada's physical mass was no longer an obstacle to the absolute, unrefined kinetic force behind the chipped blade. Kenpachi's Zanpakuto shattered 3 of Neutra's massive bone sides in a single microsecond. The jagged fragments of dense reishi exploded outward, like artillery shrapnel. Kenpachi used the momentum of his swing to sever 2 of Quinta Espada's right arms cleanly at the shoulders. Neutra screamed in agony as he was violently thrown backward by a blunt kinetic shockwave. What is wrong, insect? Kenpachi laughed as he moved forward through the settling dust, the golden yellow reishi glowing like a dying star around his boots. You grew all those extra arms only to have them cut off again? When Neutra hit the quartz sand, his heavy carapace cracked under the impact. He scrambled backward, hot blood spurting from his severed joints. The desert's utter despair finally cut through his rotting arrogance. He noticed a towering, unhinged monster approaching him. I will not lose to a Shinigami, Neutra yelled, forcing his remaining 4 arms to raise their cracked sides. He violently pushed his physical vessel off the ground, launching a desperate, erratic thrust straight at Kenpachi's throat. Kenpachi stopped walking. He lost his feral grin and replaced it with a cold, lethal, zero-latency expression. Kenpachi simply stated, "You're a boring beast now." The captain did not swing with a single hand. He raised his Zanpakuto and gripped the bare hilt with his left hand, directly below his right. He effortlessly lowered his center of gravity, his heavy boots cracking the subterranean bedrock of Las Noches. Kenpachi whispered, "I haven't used both hands in a very long time." The Quinta Espada was inches away, his scythes screaming through the silence. Kenpachi swung the heavy iron down. The physical space was violently cleaved in two. The two-handed strike's hyper-condensed, unrefined kinetic force cut through the physical space, creating a blinding shockwave of golden-yellow reishi that tore a massive, devastating fissure directly through the courtyard and up into the artificial blue sky. The chipped steel went through Neutra Gilga. The stench of rotting reishi was gone. Neutra's 4 remaining arms dropped to his sides, the heavy bone scythes shattering as they hit the stone. A massive, catastrophic vertical line of hot blood erupted from his forehead to his waist. The Quinta Espada fell backward, crashing heavily onto the pulverized quartz sand. His single eye stared blankly at the artificial sky. The executioner's absolute apex had been broken. The two-handed strike's kinetic energy gradually dissipated. Captain Kenpachi Zaraki's hyper-condensed, golden-yellow reishi, which had been violently forced into an excited, lethal state, quickly lost its astronomical heat. The dense spiritual particles returned abruptly to their stable energy levels, emitting faint, fading flashes of ambient light as they settled into localized, predictable orbits around the crushed quartz. The physical atmospheric pressure in the courtyard returned to a neutral, sterile baseline. Neutra Gilga's towering, ruined vessel fell backward. Time seemed to stall in the dead air. The Quinta Espada looked up, his single predatory eye tracing the artificial blue sky he had fought so hard to conquer. As his body fell toward the white masonry, his gaze shifted slightly, locking on the tiny, weeping form of Nell sitting in the dust. Arrancar stared back. The heavy, rotting arrogance that had defined Neutra's existence had vanished, replaced by a hollow, complete silence. He did not say a final curse. His eyes simply lost its predatory focus, emptying of reishi before his back hit the stone. The heavy thud of his body hitting the pulverized quartz confirmed the board's reality. The Quinta Espada had died. Kenpachi Zaraki rested his bloodied iron on his shoulder. The feral, massive grin on his scarred face faded, leaving behind a quiet, almost disappointed sigh. He looked down at the corpse for a single second, acknowledging the end of the slaughter, before turning away from the fallen insect. "Is that the absolute limit of the executioners?" Kenpachi muttered, his voice low and heavy. He broke too quickly. At the crater's edge, Orihime Inoue dropped her pale hands. The golden reishi of her Soden Kishun faded into the surrounding air. The catastrophic kinetic trauma in Ichigo Kurisaki's leg was repaired, the bone knitted, and the blood flow was restored. She did not collapse, but her breathing was labored and shallow due to the sheer biological toll of reversing so much death. She pressed her fingers against Ichigo's black coat for 1 second, focusing on his structural integrity over her own exhaustion. She did not say a word of relief. The absolute, heavy reality of his survival was a shared, unspoken gravity for them. Ichigo pushed his physical vessel from the stone. He did not stumble. His combat boots remained firmly against the masonry, his pale blue intent gradually returning to a stable orbit within his muscle fibers. He gripped Tensa Zangetsu's cloth-wrapped hilt and refused to sheathe the black iron. The black water within his soul was calm, despite the darkness and flooding. The pale, sleeping avatar of Naruto Uzumaki remained asleep on the cracked pillar, the ancient, unyielding gravity of the inner god content that the vanguard had survived the storm. "Captain," Ichigo said, acknowledging the towering monster of the 11th Division. Kenpachi glanced over his shoulder, focusing on the substitute. "You are still standing, Ichigo. Good. I thought I'd have to drag your body back to the Seirei. Finish up your business. We still have more of this dome to crush." Ichigo nodded. He looked down at Orihime and reached out his free hand to help her get up from the crushed stone. The courtyard's atmospheric pressure dissipated before he could touch her. Unlike Ulquiorra's reishi, it did not collapse completely into darkness. It did not aggressively warp the air, as Grimmjow or Neutra intended. The ambient reishi of the desert simply stopped providing physical resistance. It was a complete, terrifyingly frictionless zero-drag environment. A tall, unremarkable man appeared directly between Ichigo and Orihime. There was no sound of the shunpo. There was no displacement of air. He ignored the physical mechanics of velocity, ignoring Kenpachi's perimeter and Ichigo's battle-hardened instincts as if they were stationary. The man wore a white Arankar uniform, unbuttoned at the chest, revealing a dark hollow hole. His brown hair was wavy and unkempt, and his half-lidded eyes radiated a profound, absolute exhaustion that made Dordogn's toxic boredom appear frantic. Coyote Stark placed his hands casually in his pockets. "Sorry," Stark drawled, his voice flat and frictionless, carrying no kinetic intent. "But Lord Aizen has specifically requested that I bring her back." Ichigo violently pushed his pale blue reishi into his legs, resulting in a desperate shunpo. He brought Tensa Zangetsu's heavy black iron forward, intending to sever Arankar's arm before he could reach the golden light. Stark did not even draw a blade. He simply moved his center of gravity back by a fraction of a millimeter. The black katana made a devastating arc through the empty air, missing Stark's chest. The Primera Espada ignored the lethal kinetic shockwave that struck inches from his face. He reached out with his left hand and wrapped his fingers around Orihime's arm. "Ichigo!" Orihime exclaimed, surprised by the lack of hostility in the Arankar's movement. "I despise doing this," Stark sighed, without malice. The physical space around Stark and Orihime became blurred. Before Ichigo could violently correct his momentum for a second strike, and Kenpachi could lift his chipped iron from his shoulder, the frictionless shadow vanished from the courtyard. Dead air rushed back into the vacuum. When Ichigo's combat boots hit the pulverized quartz, his brown eyes widened in horror. The golden light had disappeared from the grid. The board had been catastrophically reset. The black steel of Tensa Zangetsu cut a perfect, hyper-concentrated arc through nothing. The kinetic shockwave from Ichigo Kurisaki's swing violently tore a deep fissure into the pulverized white masonry, missing the physical space where Coyote Stark and Orihime Inoue had stood a microsecond prior. The heavy iron ground into the dead air, throwing a shower of useless white dust into the false sunlight. Ichigo's combat boots dug into the crushed quartz, his physical vessel stumbling slightly from the unresisted momentum. He looked into the emptiness and a sudden copper taste flooded his mouth. The immediate grid was missing the warm, golden reishi that had steadied his pulse and repaired his fractured biology. It didn't fade. It was surgically, catastrophically removed. "She's gone," Ichigo rasped, his voice low and raw, scraping against his healing ribs. He didn't search the courtyard frantically. His instinct, honed in battle, pulled his awareness outward with violent insistence, trying to follow the trajectory of the Primera Espada. But the air pressure disappeared. No reishi trail. The frictionless shadow had cheated the laws of physics that governed speed, and left no kinetic wake at all. Captain Kenpachi Zaraki stood still, his chipped, blood-stained iron casually resting on his shoulder. The little bells in his spiky hair had ceased to ring. "He was fast," Kenpachi drawled, squinting his single eye as he gazed into the air. His deep bass held no frustration, no panic, only the heavy, clinical acknowledgement of an apex predator taking stock of another. He didn't touch the reishi. He just slipped through the cracks in the density. Deep in the drowned architecture of Ichigo's soul, the dark water reared up, violently, catastrophically. The titanic kinetic offset smacked into the fractured stone column in the middle of the empty. Naruto Uzumaki's pale, sleeping body did not stir, but his physical form spasmed, an ancient, heavy frown crossing his features. The unyielding gravity of the inner god burned in fierce, absolute refusal to embrace the sudden loss of the pack. Ichigo's fatigue was swallowed up by the primal biological drive to reclaim the golden light. He gripped the heavy manji guard of his sword in both hands, his knuckles going stark white. He drove his pale blue intent to hyper-condense rapidly within his core, preparing to launch his physical vessel across the labyrinth to hunt down the shadow. The physical atmospheric pressure of the whole dome changed before Ichigo could even shunpo. It wasn't a local, kinetic eruption. It was a heavy, processed reishi blanket pinning every molecule of oxygen in Las Noches, an absolute, suffocating blanket. The artificial blue sky above them darkened violently, the sterile sunlight replaced by a heavy, arrogant gravity that tasted of pure superiority. "You have all fought commendably, with absolute ferocity." The voice did not come from the crumbling corridors. It was heard through the fabric of the artificial sky, echoing down with a smooth, terrifyingly calm cadence that bypassed the eardrums and vibrated directly against the spine. Sosuke Aizen Kenpachi threw his head back and a wide, wild grin split his scarred face. "So now you want to talk, Aizen?" Come down here and let me try my iron on your skin. I have no need to fight you, Captain Zaraki, came Aizen's voice, floating down, devoid of malice or fear. It was a clinical, detached tone like a scientist observing insects in a glass jar. The board's already laid out. Ichigo slammed his boots down hard on the stone, heavy black reishi bleeding from tensa zanjetsu to push against the suffocating atmospheric pressure. Where is she? Ichigo screamed, his voice ripped raw into the dead air. Kurosaki Ichigo, you are safe with me. Aizen. Orihime Inoue. Aizen said gently, weaponizing the sheer arrogance of his calm. But you don't know what she is up to. She was never the grand prize. She was the bait. The crushing, stubborn reality of the grid violently collided with Ichigo's chest. You are instinctively protective of your pack, Aizen said, his voice reverberating off all the broken pillars at once. I thought if I threatened the human girl you would throw your physical vessel violently into Hueco Mundo. And as expected, the Seireiti could not ignore the chaotic disturbance. They sent 4 of their deadliest heavy iron captains to reinforce the perimeter. The absolute silence of the courtyard was deafening. Zaraki. Kuchiki. Yunohane. Kuretsuchi, said Aizen, sealing the physical space with the heavy atmospheric pressure. I have cut off a huge percentage of the tactical mass of Soul Society by bringing you and the vanguard into this dome. Reishi signatures, Los Noches. They were designed to keep you isolated and delayed. A gargantuan garganta, a massive, jagged tear of pitch black reishi, began to violently split open in the artificial blue sky, directly above the central tower of the palace. Aizen said, I am closing the dimensional gates of Hueco Mundo. His voice was the last, absolute judgment of a god. You are stuck in the desert. I'll atomize Karakura town and forge the Okayan and leave this dead world. The game in the dark is over. The garganta snapped shut violently, swallowing the heavy arrogance of Reishi of Sosuke Aizen and the top 3 Espada. The false sun crept back into the shattered courtyard, but the dead air had the taste of utter isolation. The board was in lock-up. They were caught in the sterile maze. The sun had been pulled down to the world of man. Ichigo lowered his heavy black iron, brown eyes staring up at the false, unbroken sky. It was total defeat that the grid's logic required. But the deep, ancient gravity of his blood did not know the cage. The sleeping god would not relent. Ichigo clenched his bruised fingers and the intent, pale blue, roared back into his muscles. Aizen thinks a closed door is enough. Ichigo ground out, despair stripped from his voice. Then we rip down the sky. The heavy, arrogant atmospheric pressure of Sosuke Aizen's voice dissipated from the artificial blue sky, leaving the ruined courtyard of Los Noches trapped in an absolute, suffocating silence. The garganta, the massive dimensional rift, was closed. The air tasted of trapped ozone, crushed quartz, the cold hard reality of catastrophic tactical failure. The desert was filled with the Seireiti's deadliest captains, and all of the vanguard, and the monsters marched into the human world. Ichigo Kurosaki froze in place, his combat boots on the white masonry pulverized. His brown eyes stayed fixed on the unbroken false sky. And the grid logically required that you be in absolute despair. The board had been turned. The pieces isolated. TCH. Too much talking, drawled Captain Kenpachi Zaraki, breaking the dead air. The great captain paid no heed to the great, apocalyptic decree. He turned his back to the artificial sun, the chipped and bloodstained iron across his shoulder. He studied the great, ruined craters that tore through the desert floor, a deep, feral annoyance crossing his scarred face. All that heavy reishi and he just runs off to the human world. Kenpachi grunted, his one eye taking in the sterile maze. Whatever. I don't give a damn about his boring plans. There must be more Arankar hidden in this dome to cut. Ichigo slowly lowered the heavy black iron tensa zanjetsu with the tip of the sleek blade against the crushed stone. Aizen took her, Ichigo croaked, his voice raw and shredded in his throat. Coppery taste was strong on his tongue. Stark took her. Aizen took her. Ichigo. He didn't take her to the human world. The steady, quiet voice was not that of the 11th Division's captain. Captain Retsu Yunohana stepped out of the heavy shadows of an unbroken corridor, her pure white houri untainted by the ambient dust. Her dark hair was braided down her chest and she had an incredibly dense, terrifyingly serene aura that stabilized the chaotic reishi of the courtyard. Lieutenant Izan Katetsu followed silently behind her. Kenpachi's feral grin vanished into a flat scowl at the sight of the 4th Division captain, and he clicked his tongue. He turned away his physical vessel, clearly having no biological need at all to interact with the healer. "Captain Unohana," Ichigo whispered, the tension in his battered shoulders easing a little. "Izan has been tracing the reishi signatures all through the labyrinth," Unohana said quietly, her dark eyes giving no hint of panic. She halted a few yards away, staring down at the massive, catastrophic kinetic trauma that littered the courtyard. Aizen Sosuke and his 3 most powerful Espada left by way of the Garganta. But the reishi signature of the human girl did not disappear into the void. It was forcibly moved. Ichigo stepped forth, forcibly freezing his weary muscles. "We're at the 5th tower," Izan said, her voice clinical, pushing her glasses up her nose. "Orihime Inou's reishi signature was deposited at the very top of the central canopy. She's still in Las Noches." The heavy, catastrophic despair that Aizen had tried to wield as a weapon against the vanguard was violently shattered. The dark water in the drowned architecture of Ichigo's inner world roiled violently. The fierce kinetic blow shattered the fractured stone. The pale sleeping avatar of Naruto Uzumaki did not move on the pillar, but the heavy ancient gravity radiating from the god flared. The primal, biological refusal to leave the pack clamped down on the pale blue intent in Ichigo's veins like a vice. Aizen had attempted to cut through their resolve with logic, but the inner god rejected the logic of the grid. Orihime was still in the dark. The board was not done. "She's still here," Ichigo whispered, a fierce, unapologetic fire flaring violently in his brown eyes. "Don't misunderstand the nature of the board, Kurosaki," Unohana said softly, her tranquil reishi carrying a heavy, indisputable lethality. Aizen did not leave her unprotected. The reishi signature now anchoring the 5th tower is that of Quattro Espada Ulquiorra cipher. The name brought the temperature in the courtyard down to absolute zero. Ichigo could remember the catastrophic kinetic trauma of the pale Erinkar's naked hand violently piercing his sternum. He remembered the total absence of light in Ulquiorra's reishi, with no mercy and no hesitation. Grimjow's black cube had only delayed the monster. The Quattro Espada had clawed his way back into the physical plane, and now stood between Ichigo and the golden light. Ichigo gritted his teeth. "I've already died to him once today," he said, fingers bruised and gripping the manji guard of Tensa Zangetsu. "Your life force is unstable, Ichigo," Unohana said, reading the wild pulse of his pale blue will. "The golden reishi mended your broken bones and sealed the gashes, but your physical vessel is without stamina. As you are, your biology will not stand up to fighting the Quattro Espada." "I don't care," Ichigo ordered, the deep, ancient gravity of the sleeping god overwhelming his physical weariness. The conflicting wishes were mute. There was only a biological need to get to the 5th tower. "I'm not going to stay down in the dirt while she's up in the sky." Unohana did not argue. She felt the heavy, absolute intent radiating off the substitute. It was a heavy, solid thing that made no medical sense. "Fine," mumbled Unohana. She turned to face the crying Arrancar child in the dust, her calm reishi wrapping around Nell and quieting the child's panicked frenzy. "Izan and I will stabilize the rest of the wounded and secure this quadrant." Kenpachi Zaraki walked past Ichigo, his chipped iron resting on his shoulder, down a different dark corridor. "Don't get carved up before I find my way out of this maze, Ichigo," Kenpachi drawled, fading into the heavy shadows to hunt his own slaughter. Ichigo stood alone in the center of the courtyard, which was now dust and rubble. He no longer gazed at the false blue sky. His brown eyes settled on the great shining white outline of the 5th tower looming in the distance. He didn't use a shunpo. He just placed one heavy combat boot in front of the other, dragging the sleek black steel of his Zanpakuto over the quartz sand. The vanguard had been beaten and isolated and cut off from the human world. But the heavy iron was on the move. Stay tuned for more. Thank you for taking the time to listen to this video. I'm thrilled you watched the video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe for even more exciting content coming your way soon.